Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to our discussion of Josephine County Fire Protection. I'm Janet Lancaster, co-founder of FireSmart Merlin. FireSmart Merlin learns, educates, and organizes around preventing, preparing for, and surviving wildfire. Our singular focus is adapting to living with wildfire. In fact, this month is our 2-year anniversary. You can find FireSmart Merlin on Facebook, and we have a YouTube channel with educational videos. Chief Phil Turnbull is going to share his insights from 48 years as a firefighting professional, most of it here in the Rogue Valley, and as a former agency owner here in Josephine County. He will provide a history of fire protection in the county with a focus on the unprotected area, that area of Josephine County that is neither in a fire district nor within the city of Grants Pass. He will also give us an idea of where we are today and what changes a fire district will bring if passed by voters in May 2021. Before I introduce Chief Turnbull, I want to share an important public resource paid for with your taxes. The Department of Public Safety Standards and Training, DPSST, promotes excellence in public safety by delivering quality training and developing and upholding professional standards. Anyone can access the training records of public safety personnel. Here's the website, dpsstnet.state.or.us, or you can Google DPSST IRIS, I-R-I-S, DPSST Fire IRIS. That is the Information Records Inquiry System, and the one we're looking at is for the Oregon Fire Service, which is the one you want. And so we can enter anybody's name in there. Let's just, to make it easy, let's go with Jones, because I know we'd find one. Here's one, Alan Jones with the Corvallis Fire Department. And you can see all of the various qualifications, the courses, the certificates that this particular firefighter has completed, and the status as well as the expiration date. So you can do that. It's an important resource for any fire professional in the state of Oregon. If you can't see that link, send an email to firesmartmerlin@gmail.com, and we'll turn that right around and send you a link so you can just click on it. Josephine County is very lucky to have someone as experienced, qualified, and committed to public safety as we have in Chief Phil Turnbull. In addition to holding the position of fire chief with Rural Metro Fire, Phil is the lead incident commander for the Rogue Valley Fire Chiefs Association Incident Management Team. Phil has been involved in most of the large fires in Southern Oregon over the past quarter century. Chief Turnbull holds a degree in technical rescue instruction with University of Central Lancashire in Preston, England, where he also received his university teaching certificate. Chief Turnbull has instructed and consulted in a dozen countries on 4 continents over the past 25 years. Chief Turnbull has served as the curriculum director for Rescue 3 International, R3I, arguably the world's leading tech rescue training company. And Chief Turnbull was the founding chairperson for the Josephine County 911 agency. Chief, you have an amazing list of credentials. Since you are a local leader with a long history in fire service in our community, can you take just a couple minutes and tell us how you got involved in the fire service and some of your career progression?
As far as myself, I would point out that I probably had a pretty mediocre career. It's just when it spans half a century or close to it, it does add up. And the reason for that, I'm really not as old as that might make me seem. I started as a volunteer at the age of 16. And by the time I graduated from high school, I was a state certified paramedic and an apparatus operator. In fact, I moved into the fire station with my parents' permission on my 17th birthday. For the next several years, I played the role of a fire bum. You've heard of beach bums or surf bums. I followed fire seasons around, worked seasonal jobs for ODF, U.S. Forest Service, and various fire departments, volunteering at the local fire department wherever I happened to land for a while, and worked on adding to my credentials and attending various college classes. And a number of universities and colleges. And then I met a really cute young paramedic, and she indicated that she'd be willing to tolerate the lifestyle of a fire bum. Now, I won't say she lied, but I will say within just a few short years, I had a full-time job as a firefighter with the city of Eugene, a house, twin boys, and my third son on the way. And from there, and that was a really awesome fire department to be with. It still is an awesome fire department to this day. But a group of local firefighters from right here most of them actually were in Rogue River at the time, and myself became concerned about the quality of fire protection in the rural Grants Pass area where I'd grown up. And we figured out that we could actually felt we had a contribution to make and could do it through private enterprise. So we incorporated and started a company. My family was, I come from a family of entrepreneurs, if you will. So my father and my brother in particular provided the business savvy that we needed. I did not have that. I was very focused, to their disappointment, on my career in public service. So I didn't follow them into real estate and other ventures that they were playing in. Nonetheless, they were invaluable to getting what became Valley Fire Service incorporated and up and running. And we operated under the name of Valley Fire Service for 16 years, from 1979 until 1994, I believe, or 95. I'm sorry. I'd have to do math. And then in 95, by that point, we realized that we were really in over our head. We'd had over a decade of struggling along, trying to do it on our own. Rural Metro was the nation's largest private fire department, and they had infrastructure and had learned lessons it was going to take us another decade or two to catch up on. So it seemed like a logical thing to join the Rural Metro family. And that transitioned, I'm fast forwarding now through a number of years, to 2013, when Rural Metro was acquired by AMR. And that was one of the best things for this community that's happened. AMR has their act together. As most of you know, they have the local ambulance franchise. They do a good job there, and they're wonderful partners. They've been very supportive of us, and the community and my employees have both benefited from their leadership. We've managed to make a number of improvements in our fleet and our working conditions, and have a pretty bright future with them. And that kind of takes us up to present. I know I fast forwarded through a lot of years there, but that's because there's too many to dwell on. Now, you, Janet, given the title of the talk here, would you like me to transition now into a broad history of fire protection in the county?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay. The first fire protection of any type that happened in Josephine County was in 1891, when the City of Grants Pass Fire Department was formed. And so they're the oldest institution of any type of firefighting in Josephine County. And it was, in fact, another half century later, before Rogue River, which is just, I realize, not Josephine County technically, but is an immediate neighbor. Rogue River incorporated in the early 40s. And then through the 50s, we had a rural fire protection district form out in the Illinois Valley. 1964, the Williams community formed a fire district of their own. Wolf Creek came along in 1978, followed by the Applegate Valley in 1979. And sometime right in there, the history is a little sketchy, but there was also a fire district that's no longer there for the community of Sunny Valley. And it formed sometime around 1980 as well. I'm not sure exactly. Now that handles the progression of, just a quick rundown of the rural fire protection districts that we have, plus the one municipality, which is Grants Pass. Parallel to that, but actually separate, is wildland firefighting. And they didn't grow on the same trajectory. When Grants Pass incorporated their fire department in the late 1800s, there was nobody suppressing wildland fires. Forest fires burned as they had for millennia upon millennia. And it wasn't until 1910 that the U.S. Forest Service embraced fighting fire, and that was following there's a story behind it, the great northern fires that burned in 3 or 4 states plus up into Canada literally over a weekend. It was a terrible firestorm. A quick side note, there was a general store in Sagal, Oregon called the Turnbull General Store, owned by my great-grandparents, and it burned down in that fire. So I've got a personal attachment to that. Nonetheless, the Forest Service was officially in the business of suppressing fires by the early 1900s. And the Oregon Department of Forestry came along in a very, very scattered piecemeal format after that. It started with a number of local fire protection associations. So you have the Coos Fire Protection Association, the Douglas Fire Protection Association. There was one over in Klamath County. I'm not even familiar with all of them, and I'm not even sure the date. I'm afraid that my history of ODF is pretty sketchy, and I didn't have time to research it, but it was over a period of time. Certainly by the early 70s, they'd consolidated most of those associations, although some of them still operate quasi-independently. It's a unique patchwork of how ODF came together to become a single state agency. Nonetheless, their role and responsibility, very much like the Forest Service, has been and continues to be wildland firefighting. In fact, statutorily, and I find this a little bizarre, but it's true, ODF is statutorily required to put a priority of forest resources, that's trees, and it can be translated literally to commercially valuable trees, over infrastructure, i.e. homes. Now, that isn't the practice, and I don't see that there's a practical problem with that, but within the statutorily, that's a fact. Now, what that means is that protecting your home, the structural fire service, and wildland firefighting grew up independently. And that was the way it was early in my career. And this is one of the advantages of being as old as I am. I witnessed a really awesome transition that happened in slow motion and has taken place over the last 20 to 30 years. It really started by sometime in the late 80s and through the early 90s. That was the first time that the ODF and the Forest Service and the structural agencies begin to really communicate. Early in my career, we would go on what were essentially wildland fires on the edge of a fire district, and ODF might be there, but we didn't share radio frequencies. We didn't really communicate with them. We got along with them fine. They were firefighting cousins, if you will, but there wasn't any real effort at coordination. And I think you can easily imagine why that led to problems, and over time, why the chiefs that mentored me and developed my way of thinking were the really early pioneers in getting those two branches of the American Fire Service to work together. And our history here locally is that as that happened, we tended to be out front. And I think some of it might be simply by necessity. Otherwise, I'm not really sure what causes that. But we have a reputation statewide as being one of the more functional areas when it comes to both our working together across the board in terms of blending structural resources and wildland resources. The Slater fire being a recent example where we were literally attached at the hip to ODF in particular, interfaced with the Forest Service and worked with one incident management structure to build the defense for the Illinois Valley out there. That wasn't that way in the 70s and early 80s at all.
So that sounds like a really good improvement over time.
I think it's an excellent improvement.
I think that's good, Phil. Let's move on to the next question that I have for you is we're talking about wildland fire and structure fire, but let's get a little more into services. So what does the term all hazard mean? I know that Rural Metro Fire is an all hazard fire agency, and how has the all hazard services and the services that have been delivered here in Josephine County evolved over time?
Okay, here in Josephine County, just like the rest of the nation, it's varied from one agency to another, but it's really pretty simple. It almost universally started with emergency medical services. The realization as CPR was being developed as a thing in the 60s that the fire departments, the fire service in particular, was unique positioned to get to patients that were suffering a medical emergency in many cases well ahead of the ambulance. There's also the fact that as we developed our abilities in terms of delivering patient care in the field and delivering more viable patients to the hospital, so the survival rate would go up, that a two-person ambulance really struggles just to have the hands that are needed to perform the patient care that's necessary. So very rapidly, we went from a history of pretty much fighting fire only. That was the only role. And in the case of the structural fire service, only fighting structure fires, not really having much to do with wildland fires. And then, and of course, everybody remembers the TV show Emergency. That kind of introduced it to America, and actually was even a little bit of a kick in the pants for a good share of America, the American Fire Service, that hadn't yet embraced that. The point is, it's really low. If we were to try to duplicate that service nationally without using the fire service, it would be outrageously expensive. It really couldn't be done. So what we found was that fire departments across America were already positioned as quick reaction forces for emergency medical services, or EMS. And so that's where it started. And that's actually where the fire service to this very day saves far more lives than we do from fire. And the standard of care, if you will, anymore across America requires a tiered response system. And with the advent of Pulse Point and other early notification systems that civilians can tap into, to where you can take advantage of your knowledge of CPR for an immediate neighbor, has put the citizenry in as the first tier now. And that's why there's AEDs in malls and so forth. Mm-hmm. Now, those aren't there for the fire department because we expect them to be used before even the fire department arrives. And so it's just an excellent system, and one embraced pretty universally by the fire service. From there, you'll find that we also discovered that there were other types of emergencies that were not being addressed either by law enforcement, search and rescue, ODOT, or any other agencies. And one of those is the next one to talk about is cutting people out of mangled cars. So there was another step that came along pretty much in parallel with EMS. And then there's also hazardous material spills, water rescues, urban search and rescue, confined space, and building collapse. And all of those, it made sense and was more cost effective to give those missions to the fire service than it was to try to solve those problems in any other way. The degree to which any given fire department performs the bulk of those assignments outside of EMS and vehicle extrication is pretty universal. The rest of it is largely driven by your local needs. If you're in the middle of a desert, it'd have to be a desert that doesn't suffer flash floods, which a lot of them do. But if your area simply never flooded and there wasn't much in the way of waterways to worry about, you probably wouldn't invest heavily in water rescue outside of educating people on the dangers of backyard pools, because you probably have those. But you get the idea. Where the communities have the problem. So as another example, the confined space rescue, this is largely thought of as workers that are, say, cleaning tanks either in a agricultural or an industrial setting, or in the case of public works, sewer manholes and so forth. Those are very, very dangerous rescues. And they tend to be centered around urban environments by and large. And so in that case, the city of Grants Pass has the confined space team used countywide for us. In trade for that, Rural Metro, which has the majority of the rivers to cover, provides an overlay of water rescue for the city of Grants Pass. So we're programmed first alarm or go immediately to supplement them on water rescues, even if they occur inside the city limits. And I could go through. I don't think I need to go through each of them, but it really does require the local services beyond even the fire service. This includes law enforcement, to simply look at what types of emergencies the community is at risk for and develop mitigation plans. And then one of the reasons that mentioning Grants Pass having the confined space team, those incidents are rare enough. There's no reason for every fire department in the county to duplicate those capabilities. What we do need to do, however, is support Grants Pass by spending our dollars on equipment and training and capabilities to where we can support other missions they have that they wouldn't have, that they would otherwise have to invest more deeply in.
Right. So there's a shared, if I'm understanding, you share resources, but you have Rural Metro has some areas technically skilled resources and equipment that maybe Grants Pass hasn't focused on, and vice versa. And I know we're going to talk about mutual aid. This is how you're able to, our whole county is able to benefit from all hazards by multiple agencies playing their roles and specific roles when it comes to some of these unusual types of incidents.
Sound like a great summary.
Okay. So the other question I just had was, do ambulances carry jaws of life or the extrication tools?
Not generally, no.
Not generally.
Yeah, and certainly not in Josephine County or any of the areas that I'm familiar with. America's a big place, though, so I would hesitate to make a single universal statement.
Right. Okay.
They might somewhere.
Right. All right.
You know, just
in our county, do the AMR ambulances, do you know, carry jaws of life?
No, they do not.
They do not. Okay. So, Chief Turnbull, as you know, the Board of County Commissioners passed an ordinance in December establishing a rural fire protection district in the unprotected area without a rate. They've committed to putting a measure for residents to vote on a permanent rate in May. And the feasibility statement has not yet been finalized, so we don't know the exact rate just yet. But I'm wondering if we can start with an explanation of this unprotected area and kind of how it came into existence with all these other fire districts that formed around, given that it's the only populated area in the state without a fire district.
Well, it certainly is the largest by far. Well, earlier we talked about the development of all the rural fire protection districts, but you are correct. What we didn't talk about was the fact that in the late 50s, the Miller family bought some fire trucks, and I think there was a partner in there whose name escapes me. I'm not an actual expert, but we had a concerned family, a local family, step up and start providing fire protection, structural fire protection, where virtually none existed at that time. And they operated up until we incorporated them into the Rural Metro family in 2013. But they had a long history. And as a result of them being there, the area didn't ever get serious about going after a fire district until one attempt that made it to the ballot circa 2007. I'm not even positive that's exactly correct, but right in there. I do know that. Outside of that, the area has been served by private enterprise, and there is in terms of the statutory view of the area, any area in the state of Oregon that does not have a municipal fire department or a rural fire protection district is classified by state statute as unprotected. So the term unprotected is often applied to the area that Grants Pass Rural originally started, where rural Metro serves today. That's not an indictment on rural Metro or the quality of fire service in that area. It's a technical term. It's a little unfortunate because it's confusing, but any property in the state of Oregon, any individual property, and there's thousands scattered throughout forest and BLM land and so forth, isolated pieces of property that is not part of a municipal fire department or a rural fire protection district is unprotected. There's a cluster of homes down at the end of the Illinois River Road at a location called Oak Flats. That is an unprotected area. There is another one right on, and I mean, I think it's literally straddles the Oregon-California border called Sunstar. And it was severely threatened and had to be protected from the Slater fire, incidentally. Those are also unprotected, but there is nothing in the state anywhere close to hundreds of square miles with 35 to 40,000 people in it. That is the unusual circumstance that we have right here. And technically, it is unprotected. You won't hear me refer to it that way, but I certainly understand when legal documents are being drawn up by the county or the state, that's the term they use.
Right. Okay, thank you. And so unprotected, it's unprotected from the view of the state, but obviously people that are in the rural metro service area, we have all hazard services available to us, and as well, County Fire also provides some services as well currently. And so it's just that we're not recognized by the state of Oregon, the Office of the State Fire Marshal, and that has some impact in terms of when there's a conflagration and marshaling resources and so forth. If we have time, we can go back to that. So can you explain, Chief Turnbull, what mutual and automatic aid are and how that collaboration and cooperation has evolved over time, and why residents in Josephine County and in the Rogue Valley should care about that?
Okay, well, the reason they should care about it is as the wildland fire threat has evolved over my career span, and it has, it appears that we can statistically demonstrate that the number and severity of fires are increasing, the intensity with which they burn. Some of that, there's a number of reasons behind it. I might mention that I recently posted an interview I did with a retired Forest Service chief, John Maupin, and it's on the Rural Metro Facebook page. If you scroll down and find it, John expands on this immensely, and it's worth listening if you're curious about what is changing in terms of threats to society and the role of the local fire service. But in simple terms, straightforward, fires are getting worse. We're not keeping up with it, and we've passed a point a long time ago where any given fire department can stand on its own. We can't. Which is what made something like the Labor Day windstorm so significant. There were so many fires throughout the state. We didn't have access to normal resources that would have come in as the cavalry to help us. And we were busy with several task forces over helping Jackson County out on the Alameda fire. We didn't even really have a whole lot from this county available to help them with the Oban chain, which was threatening the community of Shady Cove right at the same time. And then the Slater fire came out of Happy Camp and burned over the hill almost overnight. It was and became a serious, major threat to the community out in the Illinois Valley. And mutual aid, working together, is the only thing that got us through that. Now, mutual aid itself is just a term for a pre-arranged agreement. So you have the liability issues and all the terms and conditions pre-worked out on being able to assist each other. The agreement itself is an exchange of services agreement, not a cash exchange agreement. And as such, by design, we put a lot of energy into keeping it equal and reciprocal, meaning that Um, before, well, in the case of Valley Fire Service, we hadn't yet joined the rural metro family. In the case of Valley Fire Service, it was well over a decade before we'd built up the infrastructure to where we could participate in the local mutual aid agreement, the 2-county mutual aid agreement. And it's real simple. If we hadn't built up enough resources to be able to send help while still protecting our home front adequately, meaning we still need to be able to handle our own, what we call initial attack, the new starts that occur, plus the car wrecks and everything else that's going on day in and day out. If we, by sending help, end up having to call help to come in and backfill for us, we're of no value to that agreement. And so it took us about 10 years before we were invited to join. And today we actively send rural metro resources throughout the Rogue Valley, and we actively ask for help from them when we need it. And there's many, many examples of that. Now, moving on to auto aid, that you mentioned that as well. And they're often, those two terms are thrown out together. Auto aid is simply referring in all cases to very local mutual aid, where we've prearranged it through the computer dispatch system at 911, so that you get the closest engine responding, and the computer program helps the dispatchers keep track of that, because it'd be pretty easy to set a stagnant design down. You take a house that's on fire at a given location, and you're going to send the 3 closest engines, et cetera, to that location. But 1 or 2 of those engines might be out on another call. So the computer's going to just instantly reach out and get the next closest. It's an onion peel type thing, where you're getting the closest engine that's available. And it works its way out like an onion peel. And it goes beyond just the initial call. The incident commander on the fire can simply key up a mic and request what we call a second alarm. It's just the terminology we use. It has a historical background I won't go into now, but we call for a second alarm, and the dispatcher can push a button and the second alarm comes up, and it's just a continuation of that onion peel system until we've pretty much tapped out at third alarm in Josephine County. We're pretty done. If we ask for more help from Illinois Valley, Williams, Wolf Creek, Rogue River, the city of Grants Pass, we're stripping them beyond a point that they can continue to serve their own community. So at that point, at third alarm, we're reaching out to a neighboring county, and we're not going with the onion peel system anymore. We're asking for an entire task force or strike team. You'll hear those terms. They're just different variations on description of clusters of fire apparatus. And Jackson County will put together a task force and send it over here. If we ask for it, code 3, we're going to get them pretty much in a hurry. And after we go through the Rogue Valley, that's called a mobilization plan, by the way. And after we go through the Rogue Valley's mobilization plan, or that initial task force, we might be able to get 1 or 2 more if there's not much else going on. But at a certain point, as has happened many times in our history, even the entire Rogue Valley is now tapped, and we're turning to the state, and the state has a mobilization plan. Then there's also interstate compacts, and there's even international compacts. So those are additional tiers you can tap into. So on the Slater fire, as an example, we had help from, I could get this wrong, but I know we had some from Utah, and I think it was Wisconsin. They were really here before we started getting, our own state resources, because they were still tied up all over the state. There were big fires, destructive fires up and down the state.
Right. Wow, that's amazing. Okay. So the Hugo fire, I don't know if you want to take the time. I mean, I've heard that story. That was back in 2018. As being a really good example of how mutual aid worked and contained what could have been a very deadly fire. Can you spend just a couple minutes talking about how that worked in terms of mutual aid?
Sure. Unfortunately, we have several examples that have occurred since then as well, but that one was very close to home. That was in our own backyard. That was us. And one of the challenges that fire gave us, really unlike even the Slater fire, was it didn't give us hours. In some cases, we even have days of notification that the Taylor Creek fire was, burning towards the riverbanks area and the Pickett Creek area. And in the case of that type of fire, where it's starting right down on the valley floor, wind driven, with the indices being extremely high, meaning fuel moistures were low, everything was ready to burn. That's the easiest way to get through that. And then you get a start. You throw your first alarm resources at it, which includes the automatic aid we discussed. So in the case of that fire in Hugo, there was an engine out of the Hillcrest Fire Station that was out the chute immediately, along with the Monument Drive Station. ODF, of course, was mustering their resources. But within 45 minutes, they had, and we'd already escalated by several alarm levels at that point, they realized that they weren't going to get a handle on it with the initial attack resources. So it was one of those. And over the next several hours, it did go up to 199 acres. And I was going to say very fortunate to have stopped it at that point, but no, it wasn't fortunate. It was a lot of really good hard work on the part of ODF and their partners and many of the contractors that they work with. At any rate, fairly early in the fire, the Rural Metro Incident Commander and the ODF Incident Commander got together and divided up our roles to where ODF took perimeter control, primarily led by dozers, but also engines and hand crews. They were actually trying to stop the fire. And the reason we divided it up is there were so many homes, many of them burning in the interior of the fire or directly in front of it, that ODF couldn't commit resources to protecting homes while they were focused on perimeter control, if that makes sense. So we divided it up, and the Structural Fire Service took structured defense specifically, which meant in many cases, structural firefighters were working on the interior of the fire. Now and it's not all black. It doesn't burn that way in real life all at once. So it's a spotty, chaotic burn pattern. And so those homes inside are threatened. And in many cases, we've got maybe a dozen homes and only a small handful, say 3 or 4 apparatus that we have to spread between them. So they'll be constantly on the move using what we call hit and run tactics and literally playing a version of whack-a-mole, where a spot fire pops up or a draw that a fire makes a wind-driven run up a draw toward a house. Then we'll go plug that gap, put some resources there. As soon as that threat is mitigated to a modest degree, those resources are pulled and put on the next area that needs defense. We had everything committed in the Oxyoke-Hugo Road area that we had. And fairly early on in the fire, one of our local residents is a full-time battalion chief, I think, or training chief with the city of Medford, Tom McGowan. Tom showed up and took an assignment for us doing recon or scoping out an area that we felt was the next area that was going to be threatened by one flank of the fire. And Tom got up there and called for the resources that he felt he needed to protect that area. And then just by chance, that was about the time the task force was arriving from Jackson County, with quite a few of them being his employees. And we were able to then assign that task force directly, the entire task force, directly to Tom. And Tom successfully protected that entire neighborhood. Unfortunately, I don't like to tout the Hugo fire as a complete success, however. There were 2 primary residences, a number of outbuildings, and a gob of vehicles that were lost. And that is unacceptable. But the worst part is how close we were as a group. I'm talking collectively here, ODF and the structural agencies together, how close we were to being right on the razor's edge. If it had started earlier in the day, we had the fire behavior start to slow down as we lost daylight. The winds began to shift. They'd been terrible during daylight, but they began to slow down. And that gave us the break that we needed to take advantage of it However, that was real close to mimicking what happened over on the Alameda fire. That one occurred earlier in the day. The winds also on that one continued to sustain in 40-mile-an-hour gusts throughout the night.
So it could have been much worse if these conditions didn't exist.
I'm reluctant to pat ourselves on the back too hard. Yes.
Well, that's what it sounds like to an ordinary person like me. Thank you for that description. So I just have two questions left for you, Chief Turnbull. So what in your mind, given your vast history and experience, what in your mind is the biggest threat to homeowners in Josephine County in terms of fire protection today?
Well, we share all of the same threats the rest of the nation does, but our biggest individual threat that's unique to us is the indecisiveness. We have this unprotected area that we were talking about, and within the time I've been here, I've actually lost track. I wasn't really trying to count them, but you served on a committee recently where I think somebody did, and it's well over half a dozen different studies have been performed by the county over the last 3 or 4 decades. And there was one that I became aware of. What brought the area's dilemma to my attention early in my career, while I was still a young man, was a study in 1976. I learned recently, I guess there was one before that, but they popped up anywhere from 5 to 10 years apart consistently ever since then. And the reason behind it is pretty simple. Almost nobody's completely happy with the way the current system operates. And I don't take this again as an indictment on rural metro or our local firefighters. It's funding mechanisms that we're talking about. We can't find one we agree on, even though we seem to agree we don't like the way we're doing it.
Yeah.
And I think that has led to a paralysis. Now, with that said, I want to make it very clear. If somebody can find me some funding and wants me to do my part to help the really good people I have working for me protect this community, we will continue doing that. And I really don't care what the funding mechanism looks like. Public, private, tax, I don't care. Mm-hmm. That is, by nature, I do seem to get drug into politics a bit, but by nature, I'm just a firefighter.
Right.
I've got a job I want to do, and I'm perfectly willing to do it under any structure that anyone wants to design. The problem with our current structure, it's not designed. It evolved, and it evolved with some really, there's some good about it, but by and large, you want me to tick off some of the universally, well, not everything is universally despised, but there are a pretty well identifiable set of problems that go with the way service is being delivered in the unprotected area right now.
Yeah. Why don't you do that? If you can do that in a couple of minutes, that would be great.
How are we doing on time?
Yep. So we got 13 minutes, but I do want to see if we have questions too. So.
All right. Well, to start with, and again, I don't think that there's one set of problems that everybody agrees on, just like there isn't one solution that everybody agrees on. However, many of Rural Metro's customers are very much aware that they're subsidizing fire protection for the rest of the community. And I'll get pushback on that because, including I've had friends over the years say, well, I either managed to get an insurance company that found an end run, so I didn't need you, or, need a membership with Rural Metro, or I'm closer to another fire station. I know you'll show up and fight the fire anyway. And then their guilt is appeased by the fact that they're perfectly willing to pay the bill. And that works fine until they get the bill, by the way. Then they get sticker shock and everything goes out the window. But even before we talk about the sticker shock of the bill, I want to point out that even paying that bill does not make up the lost ground that the rural metro customers have been burdened with. All you're doing is renting the fire trucks and paying for the gas and the immediate payroll. It's a reimbursement for that service at that moment in time. What you didn't do was anything to make up for the fact that rural metro customers have been keeping the lights on, paying the insurance, built the building, make the payments on the fire truck, do the outrageously expensive training we need, PPE. Every air pack you see on the back of a firefighter is $7,500 to buy those things new. Yes, it's ridiculous, but it's the way it is. At any rate, it's an expensive business to be in, and the expense is in the day in, day out operation, whether the firefighters are rolling that day or not. And a expense reimbursement just doesn't even come close to making up for that. If we were to actually divide our entire budget by the number of hours we spent literally fighting fire, and this wouldn't just be us, this would be any fire department, you would find that every car fire costs more than a car. You may as well let them all burn up completely and just buy them a new car. In fact, that would even be the case for many building fires. Were it not for the problem that you can't be guaranteed it'll stick to the building of origin. If you take out your neighbor's business next door or your entire downtown industrial core, you end up thinking that the fire department would have been a pretty good deal. Maybe we should have had one. Okay, so we've got that. We've got the fact that rural metro is too expensive. Well, I already pointed out it's an expensive industry to be in. We do everything we can to operate as cost effectively as possible. And I would point out that the vast majority of our members pay $1.94 per thousand, which is the second lowest rate. Just check with the assessor's office. It's the second lowest rate in the county and one of the lowest in Southern Oregon. Williams, by the way, is the community with a slightly lower rate.
Right. And they're, if I could also interject, let people know the other 4 fire districts in Josephine County are smaller than, in terms of number of calls, resources, area covered, it's smaller combined than the rural metro service area. It's relative. I guess that's the point.
Well, go ahead and run the research and compare with comparable fire districts anywhere around the state, and you're going to find that we're right in there. We are not expensive when you compare it against the services that you're getting. We do a good job in that regard. There's also just the fact that the current situation is confusing. Talk to any of your friends that just moved to town and are expecting that there would be a local fire department, and they do that like that Minion meme. What? What? Yes, it's weird. You have to. Oh, but it isn't just a matter. You have to decide whether you want to subscribe or not. You got to decide which one you want to sign up with. And if we go with looking at this historically, there have been another 4 or so of these startup operations that have come and gone in the time I've been here. These operations that come and go, in many cases, now you're leaving it to buyer beware. You can be sold a contract where it may be close to 20 miles away from the facility that they're selling you the contract for. And that's just one issue. There can be many other problems because it's buyer beware, completely buyer beware. And so you've got that. But you've also got a more practical problem in that if you sign up with company A and company B shows up, company B may well feel obligated to bill you because otherwise they're just giving away free service. That's a bad business formula and not fair to their members. Absolutely not fair. So you end up having purchased a legitimate membership from company A and you still end up with a bill. That happens routinely. Let's see, I've already covered
and people don't like that, understandably. If you think you're paying for something and then you get a bill for the service you've already paid somebody else for, that's certainly understandable why people would not.
Right. And then, of course, because it is a completely unregulated industry and rural metro happens to be one of the longstanding senior players, we end up with a lot of that anger being pointed at us on occasion. and yet it is completely out of our control. We don't really
Phil,
have
it's,
it.
I mean, just to clarify one thing, you said that it's a completely unregulated industry. And do you mean to say, I mean, firefighting seems to be highly regulated in terms of the state and NFPA and standards, but it's more in Josephine County, the ability, there are no standards for private companies to follow. Is that what you were trying to refer
Well,
to?
there's a few OSHA regulations and so forth that apply to all of us, that any business that exists.
Right.
But when it comes to you mentioned NFPA and other national standards, you're not the only one. Yes, those standards are adhered to by the public sector statutorily. They're required to. Just isn't a problem there. And it leads to some universal similarities that allow them to work together seamlessly. So the story I told where Chief McGowan got a task force assigned to him that happened to be his own, he could have been assigned a task force of engines from Illinois Valley and Applegate Valley that he'd never worked with before. It doesn't matter. The system, the training is we've got the ability to integrate. However, that's not required on the private enterprise side. And just using the history of the number of agencies that have come and gone over the years, in many cases that public trust that comes with hanging the word fire department outside your front door is abused quite frequently.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And there are no standards on the books.
I don't want to cut you off if you had more content, but I did want to get my last question in. We're coming up on 2:00. And again, I want to see if people have questions. We may run, if we run over 2:00, can you stay if we have questions, Phil?
Not a problem.
Okay. And this is being recorded, folks. So, and we will post it. So if you have to leave at 2:00. So my last question is, and again, if you want to go back and backfill on the rest of some of the problems with the current state, you're welcome to do that. But does Rural Metro have an opinion on forming a fire district in the unprotected area based on your knowledge?
Well, to start with, of course, there isn't a firm proposal on the table. I'm not going to ask my company for an official stance until I have some pretty solid facts to present to them. Now, with that said, I believe, and Rural Metro and the parent company AMR believe it's a reasonable question. There's nothing wrong with it. Now, I do have, it's so polarized that I know that I'm going to upset some people simply by saying it's a reasonable question because they feel I'm violating the trust of private enterprise or some other thing. I don't know. All I'm saying is when 99.9% of your neighbors are all doing it that way, it's not an unreasonable question. Just that simple. It's not an unreasonable question. It does allow the uniformity of support for whatever system you have. And remember, the fire district in itself, just forming a fire district, doesn't really, that in itself is not making the decision of whether or not Rural Metro will play a role, as an example. That would be up to a future board of directors. Mm-hmm. And if you're interested in supporting Rural Metro, who would be perfectly happy to stay and play a role if we're invited, you'd need to vote for people running for the board that say that they're willing to at least consider putting out an RFPD, a request for quote, putting out a bid for it. However, I think that's too early. I'm really not worried about it. At this point, we're simply trying to find if we can get the community to get past that indecisiveness and decide to do something. And a fire district, as I've said repeatedly, is a perfectly normal way to go.
Right. It is the gold standard, if you will, or the standard of care in rural areas.
Well, it provides public accountability that's currently lacking. There's nobody, when I talked about buyer beware, there's no referee. There's nobody taking responsibility for oversight. I will say that AMR and Rural Metro try to run an ethical company and not take advantage of that. But we don't report to anybody.
Right.
Literally, just as I said, normal state laws OSHA regulations, et cetera, that apply to any business. The fire district will give transparency, public accountability, and it's got one other advantage. Probably the kickback that I hear that I do think has some legitimacy is I don't trust government, and they mean that across the board in any form. I get that, as I said, I've got some sympathy for that. However, I will point out that when was the last time you heard a big controversy rippling through state or national news regarding a rural fire protection district? They're locally elected, normally a 5-person board coming right out of the community. They're focused on fire protection. They tend to have really good fingers on the pulse of their community. When they need some more money and go out for a bond or a levy, to add fire stations, an example, they do a good job of selling that. And you don't hear the citizens from the Illinois Valley, the Applegate Valley, or Williams, as an example, bad-mouthing their fire department. Those are RFPDs that tend to be well-run, very transparent, really good little organizations. And so we have that. Now, with that said, if the community does decide that a rural fire protection district is not for them, as I said, as long as I have some funding mechanism, I'm more than happy to continue to do my job until I eventually hang up my hat.
Very good. Great. Yeah. And so just for to follow on that, the government thing, so people maybe don't understand, is that right now in the unprotected area, there is a government body in charge of fire protection in the unprotected area. It's called the Josephine County Board of Commissioners. So who do you want running the show? The Josephine County Board of Commissioners, whose makeup potentially changes every 2 years, or a 5-person volunteer elected board of citizens that live in the unprotected area, none of which the current commissioners live in, or do you want county government? So it's not like a fire district is going to bring government oversight that isn't already there. It is. It's just through the commissioners. So anyways, I don't see the chat thing, so I'm going to unmute Austin. I see Austin is on here. I just want to check and see, Austin, if you see the chat. I don't know if people see the chat box. I don't see it. Or a way to raise your hand if anybody had questions. You can also send them via email to firesmartmerlin@gmail.com. And Phil, I wonder if people have questions and they want to reach out to you, since you're such a good resource and you've always been very willing to meet with Fire Smart Merlin and other people in the community. Do you have contact information where people could reach out to you?
You bet. The easiest thing to do is to email me at Phil, PHIL, .Turnbull, that's TURNBULL, @gmr.net.
If the fire district is something that matters to you, if you live in the unprotected area, if you want to send in written comments, you can, about the fire district, because the commissioners want to hear what's on the community's mind, bcc@josephinecounty.gov. You can email your comments in at any time. And I do not see any hands up at the moment. Phil, did you have anything, any closing remarks that you wanted to add before we end?
No, just thanking you and all the members of the committee that worked on getting the question this far. And I do hope we get the question asked. And as I said, I'm perfectly willing, more than willing. I look forward to any answer, because that answer in itself, regardless of which way it goes, will be a step towards resolving the issues at hand.
Yeah.
And that's what I want.
Yeah.
I'd like to focus on fighting fire. Yeah. And I like all this other stuff.
Right on. Great. Very good. Well, listen, Phil, Chief Turnbull, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. I want to thank all of the participants for being here as well. We will post this on our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and you'll get an email on that. If you're not on the Fire Smart Merlin email list, it's firesmartmerlin@gmail.com. And that way you'll be updated on future webinars, because as we move towards May, we will be doing more community education. Chief Turnbull, thank you, and be well.
Thank you very much.
Bye,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.